Hello, welcome to Priestlands School Teaching and Learning Archive Session 1. An attempt to share for posterity the best of what we've learned from educational research and cognitive science. The first session we're going to look at is these individuals here. This is what we've learned from Hermann Ebbinghaus, a German psychologist that presented some research at around the 1895. More in the current day, we have Professor Robert Bjork and Elizabeth Bjork from the University of California, and they've taught us really about how memory works. Now, a useful little picture from a teacher point of view, if we can think of the learner there and two taps, you can see the tab above, we might think of as the lessons, information, skills, knowledge we're trying to impart on the learner, but at the same process, we know from experience, we get a feeling that it comes out the other end and we get a lot forgotten. And the question would be, how quickly does that forgetting process happen? And we could turn to Hermann Ebbinghaus for that particular question. Hermann Ebbinghaus actually tried to measure his forgetting curve, as we call it, by trying to remember just some nonsense syllables such as these, and then testing how quickly he forgot them. And this is his forgetting curve. And you notice it is very, very steep. Down the bottom, we have time elapsed, and at the side, the y-axis, we have retention. And if you take a look at that, we get about 50%, or in that particular task, he got 50% forgotten within 14 minutes, which is pretty staggering. Now, don't panic. We can turn to our saviors, the Bjorks, because they told us a few things. Thing one, they said, we don't actually forget, but retrieval does become more difficult with time. So this notion of forgetting, the stuff may well be in there, but accessing it is more difficult as time goes on. Don't panic, number two. This is a particularly good one. They've actually taught us that some forgetting is actually useful for long-term learning. So forgetting is not always a bad thing. It can actually promote deeper learning in the long term. And don't panic, number three, they provide certain conditions will promote the long-term retrieval. And that's what we've learned from them. And that's the purpose of today, what those conditions might be. First, though, it's probably useful to understand how they categorize memory. So we're going to look at how they categorize memory so we understand what we're trying to achieve. In the world of psychology, they'll categorize memories in two ways, in terms of their retrieval strength and in terms of their storage strength. Retrieval strength is simply a measure of how accessible a memory is, so how quickly you can recall something if asked a particular question about something, so that's called retrieval strength. And storage strength is how inter-associated a memory is with other memories. And this one we can think of really in terms of long-term memory. Now, a lot of that will need exemplifying, so let's have a little way of exemplifying this. So here I've got a graph with two axes. You can see retrieval strength on the x-axis and storage strength on the y-axis. Now, if I start in this quadrant here, so something which might have a low storage strength but high retrieval strength, then we can think of this question: what you had for lunch yesterday. So what you had for lunch yesterday, with a little bit of thought, you will be able to retrieve that. So it's got high retrieval, but it'll have a low storage strength. It won't really be interconnected with lots of other memories. If we move to this quadrant on the left, which is low storage, low retrieval, if I asked you this question, what you had for lunch on this day, whatever day it is today, 8 months ago, that particular event will have low storage and low retrieval. Would imagine it'd be very difficult for you to remember that. Top right-hand quadrant, we have high storage and high retrieval. If I asked you the birthday dates of your children, your partner, your parents, that's got high retrieval, you'll know those, and it's high storage because it's interconnected with lots of other memories. And then this top left, high storage, low retrieval. If I asked you the names of people in your year one primary school class, maybe I presented you with a picture and you go, oh, I remember some of those people, but I can't remember their names. Their names will be in there. They'll be high storage, but you'll have difficulty retrieving them. Now, what we're aiming for in education is probably to be in this quadrant here. That's what we want the kids to be, our students to be up there. So the question is, what can we do to increase the storage strength or the long-term learning for our students? And we turn to the Bjorks for this, because Bjorks present a few different ways of doing this. One thing they say is that we can make our work high challenge. High challenge encourages students to think harder. When students think harder about the sorts of things we want them to think about, then it becomes more interconnected with other memories, other learning, and it's remembered for longer. However, we do need to be careful of avoiding cognitive overload. What I mean by that is not making things too difficult, whereby we're just going to get students chucking the towel, essentially. So that's the first thing. What else can we do to increase storage strength or long-term learning? We can do high-frequency, low-stakes testing. Actually, the Bjorks have moved this term to what they call retrieval practice now, because the word testing has negative connotations with it. So retrieval practice really means the practice of remembering things, not rereading things, learning something, putting it out of sight, and testing yourself to remember it. That's called retrieval practice. Now, this has an impact on our cognitive architecture, if you like. So we can think of the brain in terms of a connection of neurons, nerve cells, which might look a little bit like this. Now, when we learn something, so if I go to a science lesson and I learn something, we get this plasticity of neurons where they will reshape their connections. So a little bit of science learning, we get a connection between neuron A and neuron C. And a student goes to a French lesson and they learn some French, and we connect neuron B with neuron C. And then what might happen is the student does no retrieval or remembering of their science, but they actually do some retrieval sessions on their French. What happens in terms of those neurons is this. So we have more retrieval on French, and we get a stronger connection between those two neurons, promoting eventually, hopefully, long-term learning. But we might struggle to get the long-term learning out of science without doing that retrieval. Now, if we have a look in terms of Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve, what happens here, this is the interesting thing, when we do that retrieval, there we go, there's the retrieval. So our learning goes right back up to the top. And then what's more interesting is that forgetting curve, as we call it. If you look at the forgetting curve now, it is shallower, it doesn't drop, and it doesn't drop to the same point. So we're moving somewhat to reduce that notion of what feels like forgetting. What else can we do to increase storage strength is space practice. Space practice would be that you space out your retrieval or practice events. You learn something once, you put an event in to retrieve it, maybe a day, a week, a month later, and from that we get this happening. So this is Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve for space practice. You can see multiple events, and you can see every repetition. It's got repetition 1, 2, 3, 4, and repetition 5. What's really interesting is look at the forgetting curve. So those dotted lines coming back and down, and you can see eventually with space practice, they become less steep, and they essentially don't drop to the same level. So that's the effect of space practice. Does this work in the classroom? Now, this is a study by Doug Rohr and Kelly Taylor there. You can see this is 2007. And in short, they used some undergraduate students, non-math specialists. They taught a math topic unfamiliar to them. Half of the students did space practice, so they would space out the practice over 2 weeks. So they didn't do it in one go. And the other half of the students did maths practice. They did it in a single session, same number of questions. And they sat an assessment 1 week after the last practice session. And these are the results from that test. And you can see there on the left-hand side, we have the spacers. They've got a 74% accuracy rating. And then the massers, we've got the massers and the light massers. The massers would have done more practice than the light massers. There's very little difference between those massers, whether they do light mass or heavy massing, but the spaced practice students outperform the massers. So spaced practice from this study shows that it's better than mass practice. What else can we do to increase the storage strength? Or finally, is something called interleaving. Interleaving is called mixed question practice, which is different to blocked question practice, which I'll explain in a second. This is a study again by Rower and Taylor. Students were learning to use and apply different maths formula to solve problems. And when they sorted the students into two camps, 50% of the students did blocked practice, such as this. So they would study topic 1 and then test, topics 2 and then test, and topic 2, 3 and test, etc., as we would do probably conventionally, traditionally. But 50% of the students did interleaved practice, where they took topic 1 and broke it down into 3 different sessions. And you can see there in the 3 larger blocks that students are flipping between topic 1, topic 3, topic 4, topic 6, topic 2, topic 5, etc. We call it interleaved practice. Same number of questions, same amount of practice, but it's just interleaved. It's mixed as opposed to blocked. Now this is their practice performance. What's important here is there was no test delay. So if you test students right at the end of the lesson, you can see actually the blockers outperform the interleaved. So blockers were 89% accuracy, and the interleaved, the mixers, were 60%. However, if you delay the test for a week, so they test them 1 week later instead of testing them immediately, then the difference is striking. This is their test performance 1 week later. The mixers, the interleaved on the left-hand side, completely outperform the blockers. That's the notion there, that we are testing, without that week delay, we're testing long-term learning as opposed to what is an artificial performance at the end of a lesson. How does interleaving work? It's an interesting phenomenon. It actually gives the students experience in having to select strategies. So if you are mixing at practice, students, when they are trying to solve problems, are having not only to solve the problem, they're also having to select the right strategy. That's something which is probably much more realistic to what students do in examinations, whereby they're presented with a synoptic paper where you have to work out basically what the questions are about and what strategy you have to use. So that's something which is really important for students to practice, obviously. So this is finally the final slide. It summarizes Bjorks' desirable difficulties. They're called Bjorks Desirable Difficulties because there are some situations which are difficult. They make actually learning perceived to be more difficult by students, but they're desirable because they promote long-term learning. So the students have to reconcile the fact this is going to be harder, but it's worth it because it's better for long-term learning. So those are the 4. High challenge we talked about, but be careful of cognitive overload. Space practice, and there I've put a little definition underneath what we talked about as well. High frequency testing, which is also known as retrieval practice, and interleaved practice, which is also known as mixed question practice. I guess thoughts for you would be simply to think about, look, what are you doing well? What might you need to improve?